Hello everyone, hope you're doing well. Today we are looking at another devblog for the next major update in War Thunder, and this one is for the Olifant Mk1a. Now, in a bunch of recent videos, and also a bunch of recent media I suppose, Gaijin has been hinting at South Africa coming to the game, even with the update name, which is, the update Ixwa strike. That is obviously of South African origin, mainly Zulu. And when it comes to the Olifant Mk1a, it also is of South African origin. Now, what is also interesting in this devblog is they talk about how South Africa is going to be implemented in the game as a sub-tech tree of Britain. But it's a little bit confusing because they talk about in the first paragraph that it's going to be a separate branch of the British tech tree, and then in a later paragraph they talk about it as a sub-tree. Now, my guess is it's just going to be in the British tree itself, but we'll see what goes on with it. Anyway, let's talk about the history of the iconic Olifant. The story of the Olifant starts with its father tank, the Centurion, which entered service with the South African Armed Forces in the Cold War in the early 1950s. South Africa purchased a few hundred Centurion Mark III tanks from the UK, but there was a few issues with them. One of the main issues that they ran into was in the warm South African climates, the tanks were incredibly prone to overheating, and therefore South Africa sold off a lot of their Centurions to Switzerland during the 1960s. This was so they could acquire other equipment, while many of the remaining tanks that they had, the Centurions, were relegated to reserve roles. And with conflicts in the region flaring up in the 70s, the South African Armed Forces really needed some armored units. This is something, we talk about in the advocation for South Africa videos. It's definitely worth going into. And basically, several projects were initiated to modernize the Centurions that they had in service. So these projects resulted in the creation of two interim models of domestic Centurions. You had the Skoikan and also the Semel. And in parallel, however, the South African government formed a company in the private sector to develop a proper modernization package for the Centurion. Work on this project began in the mid-70s, with South African engineers taking inspiration from the Israeli shots, the Centurions. We have the Shot Caldelay in-game right now, and applying similar upgrades to what would eventually become known as the Olifant tank. The first prototype of the Olifant rolled out the factory in 1976 and underwent a bunch of testing. And shortly afterwards, the Olifant Mk1 entered production service in 1978, with production lasting until 1984. And in the early 80s, the Olifant was upgraded to the Mk1a modification, which is the variant which this devblog is talking about. This featured a domestic version of the L7 cannon, as well as other upgrades. And the Olifant Mk1a remained in service with the South African Armed Forces into the 1990s, before being succeeded by the Olifant Mk2. And in total, over 150 Olifant Mk1as were produced, which saw action in conflicts with Angola in the 1980s. So these are battle-hardened machines, and also gives us an insight in maybe the other versions of the Olifant we may see in the future. So the Olifant Mk1a is going to be coming into the game into the British tech tree, but as a sub-tree of, South African origin. Now, there are two ways that this can work. Basically, you can either have it as a branch of the British tech tree, which I think is much more likely for them to do, or you could do it helicopter style and make it its own little section, which is away from everything else. If they decide to do that, or if they decide to make it a branch, to be honest to me, it doesn't really matter. The fact is, this idea is really good for vehicles going forward, especially from nations which maybe don't have too much, or maybe have holes in their tech trees. One of the things that we've seen, especially from countries like Japan, Sweden, and also even China when it was released, is they have power BRs, but they don't have tech trees which support individuals all the way through them, therefore making certain BR brackets a little bit harder to play compared to others. You can easily solve this issue by putting in another nation into that tree, and therefore boosting those BR brackets. Now with Britain doesn't have too many issues when it comes to certain BRs, apart from around the 8380 area where it's incredibly hard to win a game, but that's just because of how the vehicles work. And with the South Africans being added to it, it just bolsters that tech tree in quite a large way, and hopefully it means that this will open a path for a bunch of other nations to be added. If South Africa goes well in the game, and a lot of people play it, and a lot of people enjoy it, this easily means that we could have other nations, Romania, Hungary, the Czechoslovakia or Czech Republic. You could even have Yugoslavia inside other nations. The main thing to understand is by not making a nation independent in the game, you now have a bit more wiggle room in how you can add it and how many vehicles you can add it in. This is a point that I brought up years ago. I think, well, at least last year, in January of 2020 or 2019, I can't remember, I talked about how to implement minor nations, and it seems to be incredibly similar to how they're doing it. So I'm very, very happy about that. When we have a look at the Olifant Mk1a itself, though, this is an upgraded Centurion. It's kind of as simple as that. The body is a Centurion body. It's very similar to the Centurions which we already have in the British tech tree, but it does have some uniqueness about it. So as talked about, it has its own weapon system, the GT3 105mm rifled cannon, which is a South African modification of the well-known L7. The major differences between this and the Centurion Mark 10 gun, for example, is this gun, the GT3, can fire APFSDS and also Heat FS rounds. So therefore, that will probably push it up in BR, probably to that 8387, as we see from something like the STRV 104, which was added a few updates ago, or maybe even last update. The other thing that it also gets is a more powerful engine. It's equipped with a 750 horsepower Continental diesel engine. This allows the vehicle to reach a much higher top speed of 45 kilometers an hour. And also, it's able to go 15 kilometers an hour in reverse, which is incredibly impressive. And one of the problems that the Centurion series has when it comes to the game, one of the problems that a lot of British tanks have, if I'm honest with you, is the fact that they're not very fast. You know, the Chieftain definitely struggles with this. The Challenger series is one of the slowest series at top tier for MBTs. And also, the Centurions are not exactly fast. And the reverse speed of a lot of the British vehicles, I mean, it's better just not to talk about them. So this will give the lines a little bit more mobility, which is incredibly important. One of the things that it doesn't upgrade a ton, though, is the protection. So the armor itself is going to stay the same from the other Centurion vehicles. Now, generally, if we're talking about the triangle, you know, the big triangle of ground vehicles, you have mobility, armor, and firepower. I would definitely, in War Thunder, much have the two factors of firepower and mobility over the armor set, especially at the BR that this thing's going to come in, because if it's going to come in around that 8387, which, I mean, I'm guessing it is, one of the problems you're going to have is, you know, a lot of people are running around with stabilizers, which this thing does have, by the way, which is great, but they're running around with stabilizers, APFSDS or Heat FS, and they're going to go through you anyway, no matter how much armor you put on it. That's one of the issues I have with the STRV 104 when I spaded it. The STRV 104, being a Centurion platform, I enjoyed it quite a lot, but it has a bunch of extra armor on it, which only weighs down the vehicle and doesn't really do too much for your protection because of the fact that people aren't firing chemical munitions at you. Most people are firing APFSDS in the kinetic form. So with something like the Olifant, since it doesn't have all of this extra protection, that means its mobility is going to be a lot better for the vehicle itself. And the fact that they're adding this in, the fact that they're adding a bunch of other South African vehicles in, it makes me incredibly happy. Pretty much a lot of the community that I've talked to from South Africa has been incredibly kind, incredibly courteous, and just overall a pleasure to talk to. And to see another nation be properly represented when it comes to the game. And I know there will be some people out there who will be sad that it isn't an independent tech tree, but as we've talked about before, the question is, would you, if you hang on to the idea of an independent tech tree and there aren't enough vehicles or the development time is too long for it, therefore you don't see the vehicles, would you rather have a situation like this? And I think the majority of people would say yes, and at least in my opinion. So I'm hoping that people will be happy to see these vehicles. I've seen a lot of optimism when it comes to a lot of the South African stuff. I'm incredibly optimistic about them, and I'm incredibly happy to be able to see them here in this sub-tech tree format, because it opens up so many possibilities. It opens up so many things that the game can go through, and that to me is great, because now we can have a chat about them, and now we can work out scenarios where we go forward with these ideas, and I think that would just be absolutely wonderful. It's a great time to be involved in War Thunder right now. There's a lot of interesting stuff going on, there's a lot of interesting conversations, and a lot of interesting things to talk about when it comes to the future. I hope you all have a wonderful day, and I will see you next time. I'd just like to thank Teddy, John Ryman, Universe, Conte Baraka, Trigger Hippie, Eugens Terry, Ambrosius McClellan, Daniel Stanton, Martinez, B. Young, Hosest Kishore, Hans, Bareen, and Samuel Schlick for supporting the channel.